This video is going to be talking through the sources about Gaius's or Caligula's tyrannical behaviour. There's going to be four source authors: Suetonius, Josephus, the younger Seneca, and Cassius Dio. So just a heads up, there are some descriptions of some pretty unpleasant behaviour by Caligula and people who do acts on behalf of him. But I'm not going to lie, these sources kind of make me chuckle just because the violence and the behaviour is so ridiculously outrageous that if it hadn't happened, you never believe it would ever happen. If you see what I mean, it's just one of those kind of plot lines, kind of like 2020, I guess. Right, so we're going to start with this section of Suetonius, and it says the following instance would illustrate, his bloodthirstiness. That kind of gives you a flavour of what's going to come next. So it talks about the fact that he has collected wild animals, but he finds the meat too expensive, so he decides to feed them criminals instead. Sorry, I told you, it makes me chuckle because it's just ridiculous. And he says, he doesn't care about what these guys have been charged with. Doesn't matter, just kind of looked them up and went, yeah, kill them all, these people. So gives an example, kill every man between that bald head and the other one over there. So completely indiscriminate. These criminals could have quite literally just stolen a loaf of bread. It doesn't matter. They're going to be executed by being fed to lions. Someone is sworn to fight in the arena if Gaius recovered from an illness, and then so Gaius forced him to do this and watched really closely. And then it talks about other ones about, another fellow had promised to kind of commit suicide, and Gaius found he was alive, ordered him to be dressed in wreaths and fillets, driven through Rome by the imperial slaves, and then fling him into the river, which isn't funny. But it's kind of funny. Anyway, so men of decent families, so they'd be senators or equestrians, were branded at his command. So literally have their flesh burnt with symbols, and then sent down the mines or put to work on roads, or again thrown to the wild beasts. Others were sawn in half. Others were kept in really small cages, so they were forced to kind of on all fours. Just ridiculous behaviour. Absolutely ridiculous behaviour. Gets a little bit worse. So any parents whose sons are being executed, the parents had to watch. And it says, father excused himself on the ground of ill health, and he sent basically an entourage to go and collect him so he could get there. He sort of invited another father to dinner just after son's execution, and he overflows with good fellowship and attempt to make him laugh and joke. So completely inappropriate behaviour. He watched the manager of the gladiatorial wild beast shows being flogged with chains for several days. And a really gross bit next, it killed him only when the smell of suppurating brains become insupportable. So that, in other words, I'm really sorry for this. So basically this kid's head had been cracked open and the brains were exposed and they were beginning to, go rotten. And that's when this guy's alive, and that's when he stops it. Ugh, really grim. But anyway. So it talks about, a writer was burned alive because of this insulting double entendre. There's a knight about to be thrown to wild beasts. Hang on a second. I'll highlight that because it's treatment of the equestrians. He shouts he's innocent, so guys brought him back and removed his tongue, then carries on so he can't complain. You're kind of spotting a bit of a pattern of behaviour here. Then there's a bit about some exiles. These stories just go on and on and on. So Gaius had this new batch of exiles mostly praying for his own death, so he sent agents from Ireland to Ireland to have them all killed. He persuades some of his colleagues to challenge him as a public enemy when he entered the house, stab him with their pens, and then hand him over to lynching of the rest of the Senate. So the Senate's being used to kind of mob rule to kill off these people who doesn't like him. And there's another disgusting description about the poor senators been hacked to death with pens. So their limbs, organs, and guts had to be dragged through the streets afterwards and sort of dumped by Gaius's feet. And then it kind of gets worse. Well, not worse. Then he talks about how it's not just his behaviour, it's his language. So he's really insulting. He's really inflexible. He sort of does anything he wants to do, which is what this is basically describing. And then he sort of, his sort of throwaway attitude to all of this. When signing the execution list, he used to say, "I'm clearing my accounts." So he doesn't care about life and death. It's just a piece of paper to him. It's fun. You should be getting that kind of impression here. He's delighting in the absolute murder and chaos that he's putting forward. The method of execution he preferred was to inflict numerous small wounds. So literally just you slowly would bleed to death because of these small cuts. You're not just having your throat slashed or whatever. You would die really, really slowly and really, really painfully. which is really horrible, obviously. It also shows his kind of contradictory behaviour. So he would indiscriminately abuse the Senate, as having been friends with Sejanus, as obviously poor relationship with the Senate, or informers against his mothers and brothers. And we talked about this with the relationship with the Senate earlier in the previous video, where he supposedly had burned the papers that were used in the treason trials under Tiberius, and now he sort of reproduces these papers and brings them forward, and that's when these people are then executed as well. And then he sort of exclaims that Tiberius was right to do what he had done, when previously he'd been sort of saying, "Oh, Tiberius was really horrible. I'm really sorry." So I don't think the Senate or anyone really kind of knew where they stood with him, which obviously makes life very difficult to live. I don't know where that was going, but it's a bit depressing. And again, there's some more examples of him just killing everybody because he wasn't very happy with the fight in a gladiatorial show. He went on complaining about how bad the times were, particularly there had been no public disasters like the Varus massacre under Augustus. There hasn't been a collapse of an amphitheatre. He seems to really enjoy death and destruction, and the fact that there aren't these kind of big disasters killing, hundreds of people, he's quite disappointed. It says the prosperity of his reign would lead to it being wholly forgotten. Well, he was wrong on that front, at least. I'm sure he would be thrilled with his reputation as we study him. Suetonius continues. Everything he said was done with marked and equal cruelty. Really nice quote to remember. Frequently held trials by torture in his presence. He's often eating while it's happening. He had someone ready orders just to kind of like kill the prisoners whenever. Where else is there? He takes some people to see the bridge that he built for no apparent reason, just because he could. He takes some people to go and watch it, and then tips them all into the water, which is a bit, at a point like ours, a bit annoying. And then he had them dislodged with boat hooks and oars and left them to drown. I don't know. I'm sorry. I don't know why I find this so funny. It's ridiculous. It's just ridiculous behaviour. Anyway, sorry. Where are we then? So again, there's other sort of like humiliation of the public in his section. I didn't highlight every story because the whole thing will just be highlighted in yellow because it's all just a little bit insane. What have we got? We've got a gladiator. Sort of deliberately sort of made sure that Gaius could win. So what does Gaius do? Well, Gaius draws a real dagger and stabs him to death, as you do, and then runs around sort of going, "Yeah, I won. Well, yeah, you did because you killed him, but they're fighting with wooden swords because it was just practice. While presiding, appropriately robed at a sacrificial altar, he swung his mallet as if at the victim, but instead failed the assistant priest. So he can't even kill the right thing. So he's trying to kill an animal with a hammer, which is horrible, and then he accidentally kills the assistant priest. Yeah, sorry, not funny. It's not funny. It's people dying. It just tickles me. Anyway, moving on to Josephus. So then we kind of get this is a short section of Josephus, and there's a longer section later. So we've got Gaius' madness was now an offence to God and man. Nice quote, simple one to remember. He showed not only his sacrilegious conduct towards the Jews in Jerusalem. Remember, Josephus is a Jewish writer, so understandably he is focusing on the fact that the Jews were particularly badly treated under Gaius. But he also says, and the surrounding territory, and exports it everywhere across the Rome. Everything's going really horrible. Rome herself, above all, became only too aware of the sheer horror of his actions. Well, based on Suetonius, yet they would be aware, because, he's feeding them to animals. It's pretty obvious what's going on. Sorry. While I'm filming this, it is fireworks night, and the fireworks keep distracting me, despite in between the death and destruction of Caligula. Anyway, so he plundered and laid waste of the citizens, in particular the Senate and the members of the patricians, and he also makes attacks on the equites, so the equestrians. So he talks about where he puts them into exile, orders them to death, and confiscates property. So we've got more evidence here about his really poor relationship, particularly with the upper classes of Rome. There's notice here there's no mention about any poor treatment of the plebs beyond the criminals. This is just, he seems to particularly be targeting the Senate and the equestrians with his poor behaviour. Then we have a section of younger Seneca, who again is going to be talking about some of the bad behaviour. So we've got arrogance, accompanies cruelty, he flogs a lot of senators, he's got lots of torture, which gives you a little bit of a list. and he considered butchering the whole Senate. So this section here is really good for about the treatment of the Senate, which we could tie into the previous video. So he starts killing people at night when normally it's done during the day. Gaius is a mad beast, and such brutalities were his daily bread and I think I'm supposed to say butter, not bitter. Hang on, let's correct that while we're at it. I think he's talking about Guinness. Yeah, it's his daily bread and butter. So literally, it's just normal for him. And it's based on his previous behaviour in the other source. Yeah, it sounds quite normal for him. So he sort of condemns anyone to death. When they're being condemned, they have to have a sponge forced down their throat so they can't cry out, which fits in with the earliest story up here when he has the tongue cut out. So he also doesn't like people crying out, which, according to younger Seneca, is absolutely immoral because they should be able to cry out in pain, and denying that is to sort of harm their soul, which is what some of this bit down here talks about. He ordered his wretched victims' clothes to be torn off and the pieces rammed in their mouths if there wasn't a sponge to hand. I could add a long catalogue. Oh, sorry, I get distracted easily. Oh, why did I do that? Hang on, sorry, weird pause. There we go. I could add a long catalogue to this life of crimes, but we were tedious. I'm not sure it'd be tedious. Let's be honest, I'd find it quite funny. However, I think I get his point that the scale of Gaius's poor behaviour and tyrannical behaviour it's too much. Now, if you look at that section of Suetonius, it was just like event after event after event after event. It probably would get a little bit tedious, and also you'd be quite desensitized to it as well. So then we have this section of Cassius Dio. So we have this idea that when he first came to power, he was democratic. So we said he started really positively. Neither sent any written instructions to people of the Senate, nor did he assume any of the imperial titles. So initially, things look really good. He's acting quite Augustus-like. Everyone's really happy. And then he becomes monarchical, so that's acting like a king. So in a single day, he took all the honours which Augustus had been slow to accept. So this probably shows quite a lot about Gaius's character and maybe wanting full power or full control. He initially declines Father of the Fatherland, and then eventually not long after that he takes that too. Father of the Fatherland in your early 20s. It's not a bad way of going, is it really? It talks about the fact here that he was going around having sex with lots of people, some consensual, some not. Again, it's a promotion of his family, so Antonia is given the title of Augusta and made a priestess, which is his grandmother, just double checking. His sisters is given privileges. They can sort of watch the games with them at the front. I'm sure they loved it. And they have the right of their names to be included in prayers for his welfare and the welfare of the state, and also in the oaths of allegiance. So he's promoting his family, he's using his family, which is another key theme that we have to look at. Quite tyrannical, because obviously he's ignoring the Senate, he's promoting his family over the Senate, and he's killing off the Senate. So it ties into that kind of tyrannical behaviour. Later on, he falls out with members of his family. There's a shocker. And he forces his grandmother to commit suicide. And then it talks about him having incestual relationship with his sisters, and then obviously banishes them afterwards. So if you want to highlight that, you can do if you want to. He sort of, in public, he does not honour Tiberius, even though obviously he was his father/grandfather/heir. His grandfather more specifically. So Gaius paid Tiberius of rank of distinction besides a public funeral. And he doesn't praise Tiberius, but reminds the people of Augustus and Germanicus, which we already knew because we looked at the coin in a previous lesson. And then we have sort of going on to, just reading it through again, what Gaius then does during his later reign. So surpasses Tiberius's licentiousness and bloodthirstiness, so he's even worse than Tiberius. And initially, hang on, I'm just reread this whole section again. So initially, when he comes to power, he kind of says, Tiberius has acted really badly towards the Senate and for the treason trials. It's really awful, I'm really sorry. And then he starts to eulogize and revere him, so kind of goes, Tiberius is fantastic. Which ties in, so this section here ties in with the Suetonius? No. Hang on, sorry. Yes, the Suetonius section, when he talks about the trials being brought back with the evidence and the papers, which I have lost. Anyway, it was in Suetonius somewhere. I'm not going to bore you with me trying to read a source really, really quickly. Where are we? There we are. So that ties in with that behaviour again. So then he brings back the charge of treason and starts using it the same way that Tiberius had done. He also, more evidence of he like changes in his behaviour, so starts forbade the setting of images of him. So he initially is not promoting the imperial cult at all, and then eventually proceeds to manufacture statues of himself, which we know already. And we also know that he displays great enthusiasm for some projects and then becomes uninterested in them. Hence, his building works didn't really go anywhere, quite literally, because he just lost interest completely. And then this section here is basically making comparison between Tiberius and Gaius, sort of saying, Tiberius always remained in control. In fact, why didn't I highlight that? I don't know why I didn't highlight this. While Gaius, on the other hand, was controlled by gladiators. So, is there like an influence of maybe like Friedman on Gaius? Maybe. But what we do have is the idea that Tiberius had complete control and Gaius seems to be controlled instead. And then this gives some examples about the fact that he has like actors sort of always at his side. He used them to do everything if they were granted power, so on and so forth. What we do have again is down here guys acting in a really poor way, so drive chariots, fight in gladiatorial combats, indulge in dancing and act in tragedies. I mean, it kind of sounds like he's just living his best life. But you are emperor, so you shouldn't really be doing these things, particularly in public, because it's quite embarrassing. And I think that's the issue. He wasn't acting very empiry, like. And then we have our final section of Josephus. So this is a really long section, the tyrannical behaviour, but because you can skip over it because it repeats itself quite a lot, it's actually not too bad. So he was a flawed character. Well, yeah, that's an understatement of the century. He turns viciousness into a fine art. Fantastic quote. I'm sure you'll use that quote a lot when talking about his character. He was glutted with power. He used it for one purpose only, to do violence to others. Again, a great quote. When we're talking about the promotion and religious policy, he hated everything to do with traditional values. So again, we got that kind of change away from what Augustus was doing. We have the idea that he's indifferent to friendship, so he isn't promoting people like senators that normally the emperors would do so. It talks about the fact that he hates traditional ways of why he had incest with his own sister. Well, it's certainly not traditional, so that would make sense. And then there's a little bit of praise here from Josephus. So he calls him an outstanding public speaker, which would help keep the plebs on side. He was quite amusing. He was quite quick-witted, and he was very educated. So he sort of comes across quite nicely. But unfortunately, he was obviously a bit of a madman. And he says, despite all of this, his education could not prevent him from the ruinous effects of his acquisition of power. So clearly Josephus is sort of saying, yeah, it's not an illness. He just had too much power too young, and that was the problem. Which is quite an interesting argument. Maybe there's an element of truth to this, but what we do know from these particular sources is that this tyrannical behaviour is obviously towards mainly the Senate and the Equestrians. He's killing people left, right and centre. There's no justice going on here. And understandably, this, as it says down here, had developed into an absolute hatred. So therefore they plotted against him and finally killed him. Which is kind of a slight spoiler, but not a spoiler. It shouldn't be a surprise that eventually Caligula is assassinated. And that is it for the sources on his tyrannical behaviour. But obviously you can use other sections of the source book to boost it. And like I said, you can use this section to boost up the relationship with the Senate and the Equestrians in particular.